Good morning! I'd love to hear what you guys want on future generations of iPadOS. Pro apps, calculator would be nice. Alright, could there be any other thing you may want for iPadOS? Pro apps. Just pro apps. Alright, best we can do is quick notes, okay? It's gonna be so easy to use Scribble now on the iPad. Don't need that, just want the pro apps. Alright, I hear you, okay. Instead, how about we introduce the weather app? Oh, and the calculator? No, just weather for now. And, we want to introduce better multitasking on the iPad. That way, you can take up to 16 gigs of RAM per application. Oh, that would be great, so you can put the pro apps on now. That's not what I said, okay? There's just better multitasking because the apps are overlapping each other now, okay? Because they're overlapping, it's more like the Mac. So can we overlap the pro apps on top of each other? Oh, you're not hearing me, are you? You're not a great listener on this subject. We've been asking for like 5-6 years now. Just want the pro apps. That's literally all we've been asking for. We will continue to bring more impressive features from the Mac over to the iPad, like Stage Manager. What's Stage Manager? That's not on Mac. Don't worry, we're gonna add Stage Manager to the Mac in a future update, and then we can say that the iPad has more Mac features. What? Let's begin. So I've installed iPadOS 16 on my daily iPad, and I quickly realized how few changes they actually made. At least in regards to the majority of iPads out there, because I glossed over this on my last video, but it's actually quite mind-boggling the fact that the majority of the new Pro features and, multitasking and external monitor support that's coming to iPadOS 16 is restricted to just M1 equipped iPads, which is very, very frustrating if you realize how capable the A12Z and A12X chips are. I mean, Apple shipped an entire Mac Mini dev kit that was running macOS off of an A12Z chip just a few years ago. Yes, that technically had a little bit of a RAM boost because the A12Z chip naturally has 6 gigs of RAM, and Apple is basically software locking this Stage Manager feature to iPads that have 8 gigs of RAM and the M1 chip, which is not most iPads, and I think it's particularly annoying to people who went all out with their A12Z iPad Pros not too long ago. It was like barely over a year ago that Apple was selling, $1,000 iPads plus with terabytes of storage, and the A12Z chip is basically like M1 Lite. It is not a slow chip. It's still very fast and very capable, and yet those people who bought $1,000 devices just a little over a year ago are already getting software locked out of new iPadOS 16 experiences. I don't feel quite as ripped off because I bought my iPad Pro almost 4 years ago now, but I think the more disappointing thing is that even if I did buy an M1 iPad Air or iPad Pro, the features that they launched in iPadOS 16 don't really address any of the major concerns we've been asking for, because what Stage Manager essentially lets you do is run a couple applications at the same time. I'm very confused why Craig and Apple thought that apps overlaying each other is somehow a feature. I mean, it's a side effect of having resizable multitasking windows, but the fact of apps going on top of each other in itself is not particularly a perk that allows for a bunch of use cases that couldn't be done before, because I keep seeing all this demonstration of resizable iPad windows with Stage Manager, if you're willing to buy a brand new iPad with an M1 chip. But I feel like at the same time, everyone demoing Stage Manager is forgetting that, split view multitasking in slide over was a thing. If your goal was to run a couple applications and have one app sitting on top of another, iPads for years, even with 4 gigs of RAM, have been capable of running 3 applications simultaneously and still have a video playing in picture-in-picture. This concept that if you want to run 2 or 3 apps on an external monitor and then one app on the iPad, and that use case could only be done with 8 gigabytes of RAM, I just have a hard time wrapping my brain around when macOS Ventura is capable of running on, 2017 and 2018 MacBooks running Intel, many of which do not have very much RAM at all and had much, much slower processors than what is currently in a lot of iPads. So if you update to iPadOS 16 and you don't have an M1 iPad, you essentially get the weather app and a slightly different font on the lock screen. That's probably the most hilarious part about this update, is that just like the last couple years where iOS gets a bunch of new features on the iPhone, they intentionally leave out some of the biggest ones from iPadOS, like all those lock screen customizations that I love showing you guys, and all of the different approaches to dynamic wallpapers, which, correction by the way, you can have a separate lock screen and home screen wallpaper. I was an idiot and just didn't know how to change it, but now we already know what Apple is having in store for iPadOS 17. You would think, right, with like a bigger screen and a bigger battery and more silicon and everything, you could allow for even more widget customization and lock screen customization, but instead Apple's like, nah, that's too hard, we'll save it for another year, just like the home screen widgets took a year longer than they should have. And when Apple redesigned a weather app with all these tiles and information, they didn't want to bring that to the iPad, even though it probably would be easier to display that information on a bigger screen. It's crazy to me that Apple is still pushing, even with iPadOS 16, how you can buy these, you know, $3,000 or $4,000 or $5,000 setups. You know, they're advertising the iPad Pro with a Magic Keyboard case, saying that it can output up to a 6K resolution, literally advertising for people to buy something like a Pro Display XDR to use with their iPad, just so they can use the same apps that the iPad was already capable of running on a secondary screen and maybe 2 or 3 apps at the same time. I guess it's slightly easier to switch between apps with Stage Manager, but it's really not that big a stretch just from swiping up from the dock and opening those. And frankly, in a lot of the reviews I've been watching of new iPad Pros over the years, the biggest thing people keep requesting is applications and Mac-like functionality, and this multitasking approach doesn't really bring Mac-like functionality. It's just slightly better than what it used to be, I guess, because now you can run one app on the iPad and a couple apps on the external monitor, but it's really not that different, in my opinion, from the split screen multitasking that we had before. And again, it's just the same iPad apps that were there previously. There's no new Pro software coming to the iPad to take advantage of this silicon, and I think that was the overwhelming thing preventing people from treating the iPad more as a productivity machine and kind of a Mac replacement for some. So my expectations were low in the first place. I was not going into DubDub expecting these Pro apps, but the fact that they compromise so much and yet they software lock that to just the M1 equipped iPads, that ticks me off even further and makes me not using my iPad even more, because knowing how easy it is to lift subjects out of pictures now with iOS 16, which I love on my iPhone, I'm genuinely gonna start trying to do all of my video thumbnails off of my iPhone now and see if I can start myself an official no iPad challenge moving forward, because I love my MacBook Pro and that is a bigger display. It has a better display than my iPad. So I'm thinking if I want to use a device on the go, just living with my MacBook Pro moving forward. And if the MacBook Pro is too big or bulky for that situation, I'm just going to start using my iPhone now for more and more scenarios, because I feel like Apple is not taking iPadOS seriously. They're not listening to us on that one. They're not impressing me with any of the iPadOS 16 features. And no, I'm not willing to spend another $600 to $1,000 on a brand new iPad just so I can test out Stage Manager, because again, it's just multitasking that's not really much more efficient than just split screen was before. In fact, you got a lot of buffer and you got a lot of free space around those apps whenever you are activating Stage Manager, which most people are buying 11-inch iPads with M1, whether it's the iPad Air or iPad Pro, and those displays are already pretty tiny, so you add more buffer around those iPad apps and you have even less usable space on those apps. Yeah, no thank you, in my view. I feel like Apple has this fundamental limiting vision of iPad that it has to be worse than a Mac. It can't do what a Mac can because it's supposed to be, I don't know, the more user-friendly option. It has to be more approachable, and therefore we can't take it to the next level. We can't give it Pro app support. And, you know, I used to not advocate for dual booting macOS. I was not always a fan of that concept. The only reason I became a fan of that concept was because I started realizing how insanely slow Apple is with iPadOS. If you guys recall, my biggest feature request for iPadOS 16 was not for them to add Final Cut, Logic, or Xcode. I said, it's crazy to me that the Apple Watch, AirPods, the iPhone, and the Mac all have optimized battery charging and battery health features, and yet they still don't give that to the iPad, even though it has a bigger battery than the iPhone. And there's a very high likelihood that when people are using this thing with Sidecar or just leaving it plugged in for extended periods, you don't want it to stay at 100%, killing the battery health faster. And yet, even in iPadOS 16, there's no battery health features. They didn't even address my optimized battery charging request, which I think is a very, very core, basic, fundamental feature. It's been on the Apple Watch and iPhone for several generations. So once again, it feels like the iPadOS team is just kind of understaffed and underappreciated, and maybe Apple just intentionally wants the iPad to be software limited, and they want you to spend more money on a Mac, I guess, even though if you try to spec for spec match an iPad with a Mac, the iPad costs more. So if Apple's not giving the iPad the time and attention it deserves, why should I give the iPad time and attention it deserves? All I can really do for my iPadOS 16 impressions of today is show you the updated weather app, which aspect ratio wise is kind of aligned perfectly wrong, so that you have to scroll down to see more info, but when you scroll down you cover up other info. I don't know. The layout's not even very good with that weather app in the first place, but I knew I'd be disappointed with iPadOS 16. I just didn't expect it to be this bad and this negligent overall, so come on Apple, you can do better than this. But until you do, I really have no interest in buying another iPad. I don't care if there's an M2 14-inch iPad Pro mini LED whatever coming out later in the year, as long as they have this fundamental bottleneck on what iPadOS can be. It's just becoming a child's toy for me at this point, and it's crazy to me that iOS 16 on my iPhone is so good that it's actually making me realize I don't need to use my iPad for much anymore. Which is hard for me to say. You know, I used to have a very soft spot in my heart for the iPad. It used to be my favorite Apple product, but I think what changed is it's all about growth. It's all about seeing how the iPhone can get better, seeing how the Mac can get better, and seeing how great and refined watchOS and macOS get, and then just having the iPad stay in that like 2015, 2016 functionality state of, yeah, it's pretty good at photo editing stuff and it can do some light video editing, but if you want to do some real video editing or some real productivity, you still gotta get a Mac, and I've got the Mac, so that's what I'm gonna keep using. This is your Alp Shape here. I'll see you all in the next one.